everyone. This month at ScotlandShop, it is wedding month. So we're celebrating all things marriage and true love. So who better to join us than Annie and Jenny from our very favourite Stories of Scotland podcast to tell us romantic fairy stories of traditional love and other Scottish stories of romance. So welcome to Annie and Jenny.
Hello, we're delighted to be here this evening.
Thanks for having us back.
Oh, always good to have you back. Now, we were going to talk about love and romance in February, but we got struck down by some wild winds. So I've been waiting to hear your stories since then. So who's going to start? Some true
romance?
I'll jump in by saying that I'm definitely blaming the fairies for the bad weather in February.
They were like, there's not enough stories about fairies in here. You need to get more before you go on properly.
But shall we start off with some old-fashioned traditions about weddings in Scotland?
Yes, and some sayings. And so through time, basically, there's lots of sayings that have been translated from Gaelic into English, or they come from Scots, or they just come from like throughout Scotland, and we're not quite sure the roots of these sayings, but they've been passed down and recorded in writing. And so we thought we'd start with some of the sayings in Scotland that traditionally surround love and marriage and relationships. And so the first one is quite an obvious one, I think, but it goes, better to marry among those you know than among strangers.
Oh,
yeah. I think that's dreadful advice all round.
It is a bit of a strange one, isn't it?
I think the saying should be, go to the next town.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is true.
Meet
at the same time, you'd probably know people in the next town, right? So there's few surrounding villages would all know each other. But if some stranger turns up out of nowhere and woos you, then maybe it is a fairy prince, and you should be a bit careful with that one.
No, Jenny, these always go well. Marry the fairy prince, inherit a kingdom of gold under a mountain.
That does sound like a pretty good happily ever after to me.
Have you got any more?
Oh, yeah, like 9. So the next one is, an early marriage was often a poor marriage, and a late marriage was often a blind marriage. So this is, again, a bit of advice on when, if you look at through society and towns and people sort of look at the marriages that are happening and why they're happening, what you can usually sort of divinate from the matches or the relationships you're seeing in town. This one, I think, is my personal favorite. Women have goat's eyes in their heads for choosing men.
Is that good eyes then? Do goats have good eyes?
I'm not entirely sure.
So I used to have a goat when I was wee. Her name was Nanny, and she had very hungry eyes. She was always eating the flowers and eating anything that you left out. So perhaps it's hungry eyes? I'm not sure. But she was a very clever goat as well. Perhaps this is simply saying that women are looking for someone who can be a good cook.
That sounds good.
Share the biscuits.
And the next one is, nay herb will cure love. And I think that just goes to show that love is something we can't control. And very often we do fall in love with people that maybe others wouldn't understand. And there's nothing we can do or say or take to cure our love for someone.
Oh,
I think that's my favorite.
That's by far the loveliest. So I was looking at some old traditions, and I found some from across Scotland, but I find the island ones most interesting. So let's jump into the north of Scotland. Let's go all the way up to Shetland, where we've got some of my favourite wedding-related traditions. So the first one is the contract night, which was usually the Saturday before a wedding. And that's when the best man and another man would dress up in their finest clothes and go around to invite everyone in person. And in later day, in earlier days, they would simply recite the invitations orally, but then later they printed invites like everyone else. But it was actually the way that people approached the wedding that I find most fascinating. So everyone approached the wedding in pairs, and they would choose two of the youngest congregation to sweep away bad spirits. So that would be the youngest male relative of the groom and the youngest female relative of the bride, and they'd carry brooms and sweep away any evil spirits. So only leaving good, positive vibes for the wedding ahead. And I love that because it feels like with the wedding, we're starting with a clean slate, you know, with a couple being together. So I find that very, very charming. And then the most important thing for any wedding for me is wedding cake. So I really enjoyed that up in Shetland. Before the wedding cake was so popular, people made a special wedding scone. And along with this, they ate lovely wedding bread. And one of the customs I really enjoyed was that if someone in the locality, if someone in the neighborhood had not been invited to the wedding, then they played a little game that was kind of like, give me all your bread. So they had to sneak up to where the wedding celebration was happening and fasten a bag on the door. And if they could do this without being seen, then the bridal party was expected to fill this bag with wedding bread. So you get all of the benefit of the wedding bread without being at the ceremony. But I found a couple of accounts of this, but no one takes it very seriously. Apparently, the children were said to guard the wedding bag to make sure that no one was trying to steal the bread. But I like that they were expected to invite absolutely everyone in the area, otherwise face their bread thieves. And then I also came across some really gorgeous little customs on the Western Isles. So this is something that I first saw in the film Whiskey Galore, which is the Réiteach. And this was a betrothal ceremony before the wedding, asking for a bride's hand in marriage. So Réiteach, I think it means agreement or solution. So it's essentially an engagement party, but it's where the actual engagement is happening. So it's the community witnessing the couple agreeing to the commitment. And in Whiskey Galore, it's a pair of fiancés who are drinking whiskey out a quaich, and it's just showing how important the whiskey is in that ceremony. But in the traditional accounts, I couldn't find that many mentions of whiskey being drunk at these. And often it was a time for riddles or for the groom and the father-in-law to try to potentially outwit each other. So I've seen a couple of accounts where they'll be speaking of something that is a metaphor for how they should be treating the bride to be, and just things like like if you have a new lamb, you need to be very cautious with it and treat it tenderly and with care, these kind of things. So they're talking around in a way that they want their lives to lead, but they use all these strange metaphors for the wedding and for the future children and everything. It's all about boats and farms, but it's strangely charming. And then my other, again, food is the way to my heart. My other favourite custom from the Western Isles was food being brought as a wedding gift, including live chickens. And then people baking for the wedding instead of giving wedding gifts. And a few accounts suggested that this is because folks didn't have much money, and so they gave what they could, and what they could was what little extra they had on their craft. But I just adore the idea of a bunch of people turning up to a wedding with a couple of chickens in each hand to be like, here, this is the start of your farm. You're going to have chicken for tea, and you're going to have eggs for the next few months. This is great. Yeah. What about you, Jenny? What are your favorite wedding customs?
Mine were more to do with finding the right person to marry. So there was one of the fun ones is around springtime, you know, spring's just picking up and you hear the first cuckoo. And if you're single, when you hear your first cuckoo's call, you stand on your left foot, and interestingly, you spin anti-clockwise, which is unusual for this sort of mythology. Usually in Gaelic or Scottish mythology, it's clockwise you spin, because anti-clockwise is sort of associated with the devil or the supernatural things. And so, but on this occasion, maybe because you were invoking something a little supernatural, you hear the cuckoo, your first cuckoo of the year, and you stand on your left foot and you spin anti-clockwise and really dig your heel into the ground. Now, obviously, this doesn't work on concrete, but back in the day, they didn't have concrete, so they'd be in their favorite field listening to cuckoos. And when they'd step back and see the little hole that they'd dug, they'd look down and see what beasties were in the hole. And whatever was in there was meant to sort of serve as a clue as to who you were going to marry. So if the little worm popped up and it was curled into a pea, then maybe it was Peter that was going to be your true love. Or maybe if there was a little beetle in there and, you know, someone in the town has a love of beetles, I'm not sure, then that beetle man will be the one for you. And one of the other ones was, let's say you and Beetle Man, you're like, you know what? I've always thought it was a bit weird with his beetles, but the weird heel spinning cuckoo has drawn me towards him. So you start dating Beetle Man, and it's going really well, actually. There's a lot more to him than his beetles. and so you're now getting a bit serious, and you're thinking about marriage. You're thinking, is this the one for me? So what you do is you go out, and now it's a bit later on in the year and the ribwort is blooming. And you go and you take 3 stalks of blooming ribwort and you keep the flowers intact. And that night you go to bed and you slip the flowers under your pillow before you lay your head on it. And you dream and you sleep. And in the morning you awake and you delicately remove the pillow. Now, if the flower buds had all fallen off and sort of get squished and the flowers were now apart from the stalk, then sorry, Beetle Boy, you're out the window. But if the flowers were still attached and they were still beautiful ribwort flowers and everything was looking lovely and a bit squished, but all together, then Beetle Boy's the one. You've just found yourself a husband, and you guys can start doing some of Annie's weird traditions too.
My favorite kind of divination tradition that we came across was taking a piece of either the wedding bread or the wedding cake. And so this is for single people who have been at a wedding and who have got all the jealousy from throwing the confetti and not having anyone to go home to. So they take a piece of either wedding cake or wedding bread and they put it under their pillow the night of the wedding and they dream on it. And what is supposed to happen is you're supposed to dream of your one true love, be they beetly or not beetly.
Wormy Peter or Beetle Boy.
But shall we dive into a wee bit of my fairy lore? And I'll tell a little fairy story and then we'll get back into more wedding-y things with Jenny. Oh, yeah. Does that sound good?
I love a fairy story.
So, fairies are particularly active for weddings because they really do enjoy cake as much as I do. There's a few lovely stories. Well, not love. There's a few dark stories of grooms being tempted into fairy hills just with a little dram of whiskey. and then returning many generations later to find their wives remarried after they've gone missing. And then there's a good deal of tales about fairies stealing the wedding entertainment as they are traveling towards the wedding. So if they see a wedding fiddler, then they will tempt them inside their fairy hills so that on the day of the wedding, all of the best beats are coming from the underground realm of the fairies. You're trying to have your lovely wedding upstairs and they're having a fiddler rave downstairs. And then there's a excellent dramatic border ballad called The Elfin Knight, and it's about a fairy who tries to kidnap a woman before her wedding. He sets her a variety of riddles to solve in order to earn her freedom, and she usually solves them and then returns to her fiancé. But in other versions of the tale, the fairy is asking the woman a set of riddles in order for the fairy to become her lover. And these riddles are usually impossible tasks, and they hark back to the potential groom, the suitor, receiving impossible tasks from either the bride-to-be or the father-in-law in order to win the affection of their true love. But when we were asked if we could speak about love, and this is a story. This is one of my favorite stories of all time. It's from a Gaelic song called Hammy Ski, and it translates to just "I am tired," which is one of my favorite things to say in Gaelic. As soon as someone asks me "Kima how," it's always "Hammy ski." There's a lot of different versions of this song, and it's got a few beautiful stories within it. But all the versions usually have a couple of things in common. They're a beautiful romance story, and just a spoiler alert, they usually end in tragedy. And I think this is why we've got the slightly despairing title of Hammy Ski. But what is love without heartbreak? So let's dive into this tale. Our story begins amongst the Briar and the Bracken, the thick ferns that carpet the highland glens and hills. Our protagonist is a young woman who is cutting bracken. Now, bracken is cut by people for a few reasons. It can be used to bed down the cattle in the byre over the winter, and the roots of bracken are said to last a long time for thatched roofs. But bracken can also be cleared to make way for grass so that you can graze your livestock. And also, your bracken can be mixed with manure to make a superb fertilizer for potatoes. So your bracken is a multi-use and practical plant to harvest. It keeps your cows comfortable and your potatoes lasting all winter. And there's a couple of songs about dancing, drinking, calying, and then sleeping on a bed of bracken in the briar with your cows because you've drank a little bit too much whiskey and that's where you belong. So bracken cutting, it features in a few love songs, but it's absolutely back-breaking work. Often you're hacking at this dense plant with a hook. Sometimes you're tugging it by pulling it up by the roots to be used for thatching. So it's a really hard thing to get out of the ground. And yet, in endless stories and songs, we see folks whimsically pondering their romantic sensibilities whilst they are cutting the bracken, to the point that I think cutting the bracken could almost be a wee bit of an innuendo. So our young woman, Mary, is harvesting bracken for long, exhausting days. She's chopping it away with her sickle. Mary discovers all the hidden animals of the late harvest as she's cutting the bracken. She sees warty little toads, nervous rabbits, and easily excited pheasants. She leaves them all in peace and focuses on the rough and exhausting task of hacking the bracken, and she turns this into a song. She repeats over and over in beautiful song that she is tired and alone and cutting the bracken. Now, anyone who heard this song would surely feel sympathy for her, would surely want to help her out, but her brothers are not very empathetic. Mary's brothers refuse to help her with the bracken, and so she is absolutely in despair, because she has weeks and weeks of bracken to cut. However, something in the landscape overhears her wish. Perhaps it's our lumpy bumpy toad friend, or our quickly escaped pheasant. Maybe it was the bright moon rising slowly in the clear harvest sky who listened to Mary's pleas. It could have been a wandering sheep or a curious magpie, because the hills have ears, and they heard Mary's desperation over the bracken cutting. Whoever or whatever overheard this message, they passed it on to the supernatural world of the fairies, who decided to help Mary out. As the sun rose the next day, Mary returned to her endless cutting of the bracken and discovered that she was no longer alone. A fairy man had appeared to join her. Now, this fairy man wore a tartan plaid in the style of a shepherd, draped over his shoulders, and in his hand he had his own bracken hook. With a quiet patience, he helped her cut the gently swaying sea of ferns that lay out before them. Together they worked through the hard labour, and together the job felt significantly less excruciating. She was still tired and still cutting the bracken, but she was no longer alone. And because of this, the day passed much faster than the one before, and Mary began to feel a strong bond towards her fairy companion. As the warm sun began to set, the fairy man undraped his plaid from his shoulders and softly laid it out on a freshly cleared patch of land. The fairy invited Mary to join him, sitting on the plaid in the beautiful landscape in the late gloaming sunset hour. Mary blushed and declined her fairy friend, and she returned home. The next day, our fairy labourer returns again, committed to helping Mary harvest the bracken. Now, fairies have a magical way of doing work. They hack and they hash at their job, whatever it may be, and it looks like they're going at a regular pace, like a normal person. But then you look around and you see that they've done the job of 1,000 people. Well, maybe 12 people. They're not quite that fast. Mary began to feel so fond of her new fairy friend. She enjoyed the way that he would tell riddles to the magpies, and the way that he would always share his strange bramble wine with her. And once he even caught a tiny feather on the breeze, and he planted it in the ground. A moment later, Mary could swear a big red grouse appeared in that exact spot and noisily ran away from these bracken cutters. That evening, as the moon began to glimmer in the setting embers of the sun, the fairy again set his plaid on the ground and asked Mary to join him. And so she did join the fairy on his plaid, and she shared his bramble wine, and they shared a kiss and had a very delightful romantic time. However, Mary's little brother, the one who had never helped her cutting the bracken, he snuck up on them to see what had happened, what had delayed his sister from coming home. And he spies his sister in the arms of a fairy amongst the waves of bracken. And her wee brother, he's such a grass. He runs straight back home and he tells the rest of his brothers, the rest of Mary's family, And by the time she gets home, her mother is glaring at her. Her father is sobbing. Her brothers are cackling evilly. And her whole family forbids her from returning to cut the bracken. Mary is absolutely heartbroken as she feels such an intense connection to her fairy sweetheart. And so she tries many times to return to him, but she can never get back to the glen where they cut the bracken. Her brothers would prevent her from taking up her sickle, and they would even at times hide her. She was given jobs elsewhere in the croft, as far away from the bracken as possible. However, Mary's fairy sweetheart never forgets her. And every year he returns to the farm in the bracken cutting season, and he cuts all of the bracken for the family. He waits, but he never finds Mary there waiting for him. It's said that when the sun rises or sets in the bracken cutting season, you can still hear the voice of this forlorn fairy sweetheart on the wind. He is singing to himself that he is tired and alone and cutting the bracken. And that's always where the story of this song ends. Hamiski. But I like to imagine that it goes full circle, and whatever heard Mary's plea for help in the bracken cutting field, be it the little warty toad or the riddling magpie, somehow manages to get the message to Mary to meet the fairy in some secret place, and they can be together again. But in the Gaelic version, that does not happen. It's very sad.
We'll go with your version.
Thank you. But yeah, Jenny, do we have more love stories, more weddingy?
Yes, I have the greatest tale in all of Celtic mythology. Love tale, that is. And that's my own estimation, so take it with a pinch of salt. But this is truly regarded as a tale of love, a tale of jealousy. It's a tale of warmth, but it's also a tale of bitterness. And it is a story of the Kayak, Veera, and bride. Now, Kayak, Veera, on the podcast, we talk about her quite a lot. And there's a lot of different pieces of mythology that are all sort of rolled into one over time. And the Kayak can be different stories. The word kayak basically just means old lady or even a hag. So you could call, the old lady in your village a kayak. Or what's really nice is the word actually still, hag to us sounds like a harsh word for an old lady. But actually in Gaelic mythology, it's a word of power. The kayak is one of the most powerful Celtic gods. And she's very, very well respected and she's very powerful. But she's also not the nicest of women. She's like every human, I suppose. There are two sides. You see, she's the mother of nature. She looks after all the animals, all the deer running through the forests and all the birds sitting in the trees. But with life and animals also comes death and decay. And so the kayak is also the god of winter. And she overrules these cold, harsh months where it seems like all life altogether has sort of disappeared from the earth. Now, it's said that in November as well, so at the start of this really dark winter season, that she takes the plaid off her back, this huge great shawl that throughout the summer months as she's been moving around the Scottish mountains that she built herself has got really dirty and muddy, and she takes it off and she dips it into Corryvreckan, which is this huge whirlpool that's like, it's real and it's between two of the islands out on the west coast and you can't sail through it. It's totally treacherous. But for the kayak, it's the perfect place to wash her plaid. And so she takes it off and she gives it a good old wash. And when it's nice and white as snow, literally, she drapes it over the mountaintops. And this is the first snow of winter. And this is when her reign truly begins. But winter is harsh, and so is her reign. And like I said, this is a time of darkness and damp and death. But the world is always one of balance, and the kayak's sort of counterbalance is Bride. Now, Bride, she is beautiful and young and fresh and full of joy. And the kayak hates her for this. She hates this young, beautiful maiden so much that she kidnaps her and she takes her all over Scotland with her. And she wastes her time giving her all these silly, menial tasks that mean nothing. And again, like Annie has mentioned, all these riddles that lead nowhere and serve no one. And all they do is frustrate and upset Bride. And that's exactly what the kayak wants. And so one day, the kayak gives Bride a brown shawl. And she says to Bride, take this brown shawl to the river and wash it until it's white. I don't want to see this until it's as white as the snow on the top of the mountains. And so Bride takes the shawl and she goes down to the river. And bear in mind, this is winter. This is the kayak season. So the river water is freezing cold. And she's dipping it in and she's rubbing it, she's scrubbing it, and she's doing everything she can to try and get the brown out of the shawl. But she realizes it's not that the shawl is covered in dirt, but the wool itself is brown. There is no way she is going to be able to ever turn this shawl white. And so she sits there and with her hands freezing, and it's been hours and the sun is setting, and she's sobbing and she's sobbing and she's weeping and she doesn't know what to do, but she's got no choice. So she goes back to the kayak and she presents her with this brown shawl, and the kayak, she cackles. She cackles and she says, well then, I guess you'll have to try again tomorrow. And so Bride has no choice. She goes back down to the river the next day, and somehow it seems even colder. And this time it doesn't even take her long to start crying. Before you know it, she's just weeping by the banks of this river. She's sobbing and she's scrubbing and she's weeping and she's wailing. And all the animals in the forest have gone quiet and are listening to her lament. And when and as she's in this state of emotional sort of just, she's completely lost it basically, an old man is walking by and he hears her and he instantly can connect with this deep sorrow within her. And so he goes up to her and he says, what's the problem? What's wrong? Can I help you at all? And poor Bride, she looks up and she explains the situation and she shows him the shawl. Now, this old man just so happens to be the king of winter. Now, he takes the shawl, and being the king of winter, he knows who the kayak is and he knows what she can get like. And so he takes the shawl and he, in a second, before, Bride's even had time to wipe her eyes, he takes the shawl and he gives it a quick shake. And just like that, it's as white as the purest winter snow. Now, Bride is she's just filled with joy. And again, her joy seems to emanate throughout the forest at this moment. And she says, thank you. Who are you? Why have you helped me like this? And the man said, look, I know how the kayak can be, but take this back to her. And when she asks you how you got it to be white, for she knew this was a fruitless task, tell her that the snowdrops are back and give her these. And from behind his back, he pulls a little posy of snowdrops. And say to her that you saw the first green blades of grass poking their way through up this barren forest floor. And that will let the kayak know who helped you with the shawl. And so Bride, just so glad she doesn't have to get her hands freezing cold anymore, takes the shawl, thanks the man, and she takes the snowdrops. Now, as she's heading back to the castle, far, far away, on an island far out on the west coast, a young man is having a nice nap. And during this nap, he's dreaming. And he's dreaming of the most beautiful woman he's ever seen, crouched by the side of a river sobbing. And he can feel these waves coming from her, these waves of pure sorrow. And in this dream, all of a sudden, he gets hit with this wave of joy. And the wave of joy washes over him and he wakes up and he realizes he loves this woman. This woman is going to be his bride, and together they shall rule all of spring and summer, for he is no stranger to the kayak. For this man, his name is Angus, he is the son of the kayak. And the very reason that the Kayak has Bride, in fact, because the Kayak has known all her long that her handsome son, who is one day destined to be the king of summer, is sure to fall in love with Bride, the very epitome of spring itself, joy and life and freshness being reintroduced to the world. And so, being the deity of winter, the last thing the Kayak wants is for spring to come. And so she has kidnapped spring. And she knows that she's now on the run away from her son, who is now deeply, madly in love with Bride. And so when Bride returns to the Kayak with the snowdrops, and she says, I found these snowdrops in a glade, and there's grass pushing itself up from the ground, the Kayak knows that her reign is being threatened. And she doesn't like this at all. And so she grabs Bride and the other, I think there's 8 hags that she has that she carries around with her, who sort of do her biddings all around the world. And she causes these hags to go out and cause massive snowstorms and cause the ground to freeze and frosts like never seen before. And the poor people living on the land feel like, really, there's no way that winter will ever end. They've never seen anything like it. And so for days and days, the bride and the Kayak are traveling through these glens and little mountain valleys, from the tops of the mountains down to the bottoms of the glens. And Bride, the whole time, you see, she's also had a dream, and she's dreamt of young Angus, and she knows that he's looking for her. But how is she ever going to outsmart the Kayak? The Kayak is ancient, she's old, and she knows the mountains better than anyone. And so, again, overwhelmed with emotion, Bride starts to cry. And as she's crying, the tears are falling from her eyes, and they're falling on the barren, frozen floor of the forest. And lo, little wildflowers start to spring up. Little snowdrops over here and bluebells over there, and the grass too all starts to sort of come up all around her, for spring is inevitable. Now the Kayak knows this, and she picks up she picks up Bride, and they move on to the next glen. But Bride's now learned that she can leave a trail of spring in her tears. And if Angus can just find one snowdrop, he will be able to follow them and find them. And this is exactly what he does. And eventually he finds Bride in the Kayak in the middle of the night, and he wakes up Bride, and it's everything both of them have quite literally ever dreamed of. They know in that moment that they are to be married and wed and be in love for all of time, and that they together, the power of spring and summer, can overcome the cruel coldness of winter. And so they sneak away and they get married in secret. And with this marriage, the endless winter is broken. And from all over the lands, the grasses spring, the corn starts to grow, the flowers come out and bloom. And it's truly one of the most important days in all of the Scottish calendar. And this day is known as the Day of Bride. And it's celebrated all throughout, and it's one of the major holidays. And I have forgotten the date. Annie, can you remember the date of the Day of Bride? I've got it somewhere. But anyway,
it's 1st of February, isn't it?
1st of February it is, yes. And so on the 1st of February, spring officially breaks through the harsh, cold control of winter. And Bride and Angus are married, and together they rule over spring and summer for eternity. And so every time that we admire the blossoms, or even, walk amongst the snowdrops, then we know that it's because of their eternal love.
Oh, what a lovely story.
Yeah, told you, one of the greats. But yeah.
Well, thank you. Does that bring us to the end of our Scottish love stories for this week?
I think so, yes.
Yeah.
It was a lot of fun. It was great stories to tell.
There are so many stories. I think you've chosen some lovely ones. I did enjoy that. And I do love a fairy story, so...
Even though they all end very sadly.
Well, yes, they're all a little brutal, aren't they? But that's, yeah.
We just need to get Annie in there editing the endings.
Yeah, giving it back.
I want to do that with literally every Gaelic story I read. Like it always ends in a tragedy. If there's one thing I've learned from these stories, it's that they just need a little twist at the ending to bring a tiny bit of joy back again.
They all need a bit of bride at the end. A little bit of light coming back in.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, for sharing in our wedding month. There's lots of wedding stories on the website, lots of amazing photography and ideas if you are going to be romantic yourselves and have a wedding. Lots of weddings, of course, this year, with lots being cancelled in the last 2 years. So we've had lots of brides and grooms in the shop enjoying choosing their outfits. It's very good fun. So also, if anyone wants, you've not done your plug for your podcast, ladies, we better do that.
Yes. Well, if you enjoyed these stories and these sort of customs from the past, then you can listen to loads and loads and loads more on our podcast, Stories of Scotland, where Annie and I sort of look at Scottish history, mythology and nature, and try and really breathe new life into it and bring it to, everyone all over the world. So you can get it on any platform, Spotify, Apple. You can go on our website, www.storiesofscotland.com, I think. Just Google us, you'll find us.
I was just relying on people putting a little bit of bread under the pillow and dreaming of our website address.
I'd be bad. I'd be eating it in the middle of the night.
I know, me too. I'd be like, midnight wedding cake snack. Num, 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 num. Under my covers, wondering why I'm not dreaming of my one true love. Num, 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 num.
On that note, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing everyone next week.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Thank you so much. Cheerio.
Bye.